we'll give it a couple more minutes just to see if any other people join, and if not, we will continue with the webinar, and then we'll make this recording available to everyone afterwards. So please keep yourselves muted and your cameras off, and we'll start the webinar very shortly. Thank you. We're just going to give everybody a couple more minutes to join, because I'm aware that people have lots of phone calls these days. So we'll give a couple more minutes, and then we will get started with the webinar. In the interim, please mute yourself and keep your cameras turned off. And you'll probably hear me say that a few times. Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining the webinar. We'll start now. I expect that there may be some other people joining us as we go through the webinar. But first of all, I wanted to introduce the people that are on this and hosting the webinar. And I will take you to the next slide, where we're going to go through introductions first to the people that are hosting this webinar, and then we're going to each of us take a separate section of what we're going to talk about today, which is how to read the fundraising landscape, the current challenges and trends, how to find opportunities, and how to fundraise key skills and concepts. If everybody can keep their cameras and microphones off during the webinar, that should make things a little bit easier for those that are joining us with slightly less bandwidth. Okay, so introductions. So my name is Bryony Stenterford. I'm the head of strategic partnerships at IRC, and I will be taking us through the first part of this webinar. Overall, between us, we're hoping to make you feel less overwhelmed by the prospect of fundraising for your different programs. And now I'm going to ask the other members of the team that are going to lead this webinar to turn on their cameras and introduce themselves.
Hi, my name is Esther Glotzbach, and I work with Bryony at IRC in the Strategic Partnerships Department.
Jimena, you're muted.
Hi, I'm Jimena Duran. I work for CIMAVI. I'm the lead of the work package 10, fundraising. I have met some of you in Uganda already, so nice to see you here again for our first webinar.
Thank you very much. Okay, and if Esther and Jimena can both turn off their cameras again, that should make life easier. I'm also going to turn mine off so that you can concentrate on looking at the presentation instead of at my face. Okay, so taking you through fundraising. First of all, what we'd like you to do, and we're going to be using Menti throughout this presentation. We'd like you to go to menti.com and use the code that of 720795. That's 720795, and it's menti.com. You can go either on your phone or on your computer. And we'd like you to answer this first question so we can get an idea of where everyone's coming from. And I'm going to give you a couple of minutes just to enter in your details here. And then we should start to see things coming up on the screen. Okay, so far quite a few people from the Netherlands. That might just be because we're quick on the phone and we were already logged in. And nice to see someone from Bangladesh as well. But I know that there are other people out there. So I'll give you a couple more minutes so that we actually get a true picture of who's on there. Yay, Kenya, hello. This is not that big a webinar, so I'm not expecting us to see in a lot of countries, but it's always nice to see that we have lots. We do have some different ones. Okay, 30 more seconds, and then we'll go to the next question. I know that Jane's on there as well, so I know that we do also have Uganda. Okay, and now comes the next question.
Coming to the next question, sorry.
Okay.
There.
Okay, so this is to assess where we think everybody already is. So it'd be great if you can let us know what you think you already know about fundraising. And then if you're all telling us you're experts, then we'll finish early. Okay. I'm hoping that the people that answered a lot was myself and Jimena and Esther, but otherwise I'm not sure how much we're going to be able to tell you. Okay, Jimena, do we have another question now, or are we now continuing with the presentation?
No, we have another question.
Okay. Oh, expectations. Yeah, please enter your thoughts on today. What do you want to get out of it? Practical steps, that's a good one. Hopefully we'll give you a few. Yep, building confidence is key as well. Learning, definitely we can provide you with some of that. Oh, great. Where to start, understanding trends, global versus country fundraising, alternative financing. Excellent. Okay, overview of process. Okay, this is great. I think we'll cover quite a lot of that today, and we are also planning a follow-up. But we'll come to what might be included in the follow-up webinar later on. Jimena, do we have another question now? Or I think that was the three beginning. Yeah. Okay, perfect. Then I will start sharing my screen again. So we'll go back to the presentation. Okay, so thank you again for joining us for this webinar. We are going to talk about quite a few things today. We started with the introductions, we've done that. Now we're going to do start broad, talking about how to read the fundraising landscape, the current challenges and trends, Then we're going to look at how we would find opportunities and how to scan and do networking. And then we really start to drill down on how to fundraise, the key skills and concepts. And we're going to take it in one by one to take you through these things. Okay, so I'm going to give you an overview of the funding landscape. And I'm going to talk about the types of fundraising, the types of funding, the opportunities and challenges, how to fundraise for lobby and advocacy in WASH and IWRM, and fundraising during COVID. I'm going to come to the Menti exercise at the end of this presentation because I think that then helps set us up for when we're starting to look for opportunities to give you an idea of what you should be looking at. Okay. So, taking us through the types of funding. And I apologize in advance if some of you already know all of this. This is a little bit more general information that probably a lot of you are already exposed to. So when we talk about types of funding and types of funders, what are we talking about? So we have lots of different types. Ones that different organizations on this call might be more familiar with are institutional donors, including bilateral and multilateral donors, such as government grants. So taking money from governments such as the Dutch government, the British government, Swiss, and the Danish. Depending on which context you're in, you'll find that different governments are more involved in each context. Then we have various other different types. So earned income. That tends to be formed from services such as consultancy. So quite often you might be approached, or you might see a request for proposal for a particular service that you need to provide. Private funding. This is one bullet point for an awful lot of different ways of raising money through various private means, and private includes so many different things. So we include trusts and foundations. Foundations being organizations such as the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Hilton Foundation, the Open Society Foundation, to name some of the bigger ones, Aga Khan Foundation. These are ones that you will quite often see, particularly in the WASH and IWRM sector. Then we have high net worth individuals and ultra high net worth individuals. So a high net worth individual would be someone like Bill Gates, but quite often they also then have a foundation that they operate through in terms of how they want to disperse their monies more efficiently. High net worth individuals are great if you can find and nurture that relationship. And I will come to the opportunities and challenges of each of these types of funding on the next slide. We then have corporates. So quite often the funding from corporates is based around their corporate social responsibility programs, which is called CSR. So organizations that you would expect to see, again, depends on the context. So we will have organizations like Heineken has a foundation, but it's essentially a corporate arm, and they often give money. They give money in the areas in which they have breweries. Unilever give money in areas where they have a market share. Gap give money in areas where they have factories. I'm sure that none of this is news to any of you, but just corporates are a reason, as time goes on, they are investing more and more in their corporate social responsibility. There is a requirement from that, sometimes legally in terms of India, and quite often just to their consumers are more and more demanding that. And then we have individual donors. And individual donors, up to a certain amount, are not called high net worth individuals, and the value of your high net worth individual depends on the context in which you're working. Individual donors will be the person that pays $5, €5, £5, for example, every month to support a cause which they are aligned with or have sympathies with. This is a way that a lot of more traditional charities work, and particularly in the UK, the US, and the Netherlands. In IRC's, from IRC's perspective, we don't actually really raise any money at all from individual donors. So not every NGO raises money in that way. And then there are other ways of raising funding, which includes events such as online auctions, so art auctions, gala dinners, which also has a cost associated with it as well, and so on. But I also know that a lot of our CSO partners consider NGOs such as IRC and Simavi as donors too, because we often work with you and pay you for services. I would see that more as a type of earned income, as a payment for service consultancy, but I can see that we would quite often be seen as perhaps a more foundation type relationship. Okay, and then so now going on to
Bryony,
yes,
there is a question about
yes,
this slide.
yeah.
So Maya, she wrote, based on what methodology is this division? Could you please clarify?
There isn't a methodology per se. This is it's how, yeah, it's just the different types of donors. So an institutional donor is an institutional donor. I'm not sure what you mean by methodology. This is quite a standard type of differentiation of different donors within the fundraising world. Is there a follow-up question, Jimena? I can't see the questions, I'm sorry.
Yeah, not in the chat box.
Okay. We also have Q&A at the end of at the whole webinar as well, and you can continue to ask questions obviously in the chat box, and Lisbeth is taking notes on those and will feed them through to us at the end. I'm going to keep going because I'm also aware that I'm taking probably more time than I intended to. Okay, so then I tried to do a quick, this is obviously, there's much more behind this, but a quick sort of overview of the advantages and disadvantages of the types of donors that we have. So if we think about institutional donors, often because institutional donors tend to ask for proposals, so they request proposals, and Esther will come to the definition of that after I finish speaking. Often they have a very clear strategy, which means that they have a clear ask with very clear deadlines, and you will generally find that you can very clearly see if it's aligned with your NGO's general mission and vision. However, from some institutional donors, not all, so some institutional donors such as USAID or the EU have very low overhead recovery. So it can be really difficult, particularly in smaller organizations, to make sure that you're covering all your costs. And often, because they're asking for specific services, the funding that they give you isn't very flexible. Private funding, again, as I said, this is a really pared down version of what everything that falls underneath that. But generally, trusts and foundations, again, can be very aligned with your mission and vision, often because you initiate a conversation with them over a long period of time and can often develop that with them, or you are only talking to trusts and foundations that are aligned already with your mission and vision. That leads me to one of the disadvantages. It can take a lot of effort to develop that relationship, not even in the initial outreach, but the development of a relationship until you see any payoff from that. Similarly, high net worth individuals, if you manage to attract a high net worth individual, they tend to be very loyal. They are funding you because they're interested in the type of work that you do. And because they have a personal relationship with you, it can often be very flexible funding. However, they are a bit of a unicorn. Sometimes they can be difficult to find and can take a lot of effort to keep. Corporations, they have very clear interests. It's generally aligned with what they do in their day-to-day work. So I mentioned Unilever before, so obviously their interests are aligned to cleaning products, soaps, and so on, because that's in the terms of the wash and IWRM sector, because that's what they tend to sell. have very clear geographies normally around where they work, and it's aligned to their CSI priorities. They're very careful, however, of their reputation, rightly so, because they're a commercial organisation, and they can be very high maintenance. It can be difficult for a smaller NGO to engage with corporations. Individual giving, this is the small amounts that people give every month, very flexible. Normally, individual giving isn't tied to delivering a particular program or product, but because it's small amounts to generally from each person, you need a lot of people, which requires work to maintain to keep that flow of money coming in. Earned income consultancy in this case, clear asks, very much applying to requests for proposals with clear deadlines, but because of that, how you use that money isn't very flexible. And the events, for example, events organized in-house can be personalized, so it can be very much aligned with what you do, but it can be a lot of effort for little or no return. So, for example, organizing a gala dinner with an auction might sound like a great way of bringing in lots of money, but it costs a lot of money to put it on. INGOs, which I mentioned on the previous slide, they know your work. It's easier to create relationships because they're working alongside you a lot of the time. They know your challenges, but in the end, they're not the ultimate funder. So there could be more risk in terms of if they suddenly stop getting funding from their funders, then your funding can also stop, and there's nothing that they can do about that. I am going on to the next one. So I'm going to go to the Menti question after this slide. So one of the first questions that I ask about fundraising generally and fundraising for advocacy in particular in Washington WRM is, does anyone know you need money? How do they know you need money? What is your unique selling point? Why would they support your advocacy work and not something that's more tangible, particularly if they have to report back to shareholders? It's really important that you know your story, and Esther will come on to this in a moment. And is there a way that perhaps you can combine advocacy with tangibles, particularly for some donors, they might ask that. We're also undertaking some work at the moment on funder mapping for advocacy. So looking at what can get funded in advocacy. So there are quite a lot of different organisations that fund advocacy, which includes institutional donors such as governments and particularly those in the EU, and foundations. There are a lot of different themes related to advocacy that can get funded, and those related to Washington IWRM that I looked at on a quick scan include gender rights in terms of access, human rights, governance, environment, national resources management, citizen participation, so ensuring that people's voices are heard, particularly from those that are less well represented normally, poverty reduction, and agriculture, which I know applies to some organisations that we potentially have on the webinar. And then I just wanted to add a tip on this, because we're talking about advocacy particularly, is that a lot of the time, particularly in Europe, we use lobby and advocacy together, or lobby or advocacy sometimes interchangeably. We can never ever use that in a proposal or a conversation with USA-based organisations, simply because it's not permissible with a lot of US organisations. Jimena, I'm going to do my next slide, and then I'd like to go to the Menti if that's possible. Okay. So at the moment, there are lots of opportunities around COVID-19, which is a kind of a funny thing to say. But despite the fact that this is a really difficult time for a lot of organizations, there are also a lot of opportunities. There's a lot of calls and requests and money sloshing around for WASH and advocacy, and particularly advocacy related to communications and different ways of reaching particularly the hard to reach groups. From what I'm seeing, there's a very quick turnaround for funding out there. There's obviously a lot of focus on hygiene, including hand and surface hygiene, and the messaging around that, whether within schools or local religious local religious areas, or even sort of mass communications in terms of radio, newspapers, television, which is fantastic that hand washing and hygiene is getting the focus. But I see a potential, particularly in a few months' time, when people are starting to look at reporting on this, that the potential for misspending and inappropriate use of funds. So needing for NGOs, making sure that they're not over promising and under delivering. So if you promise to do something, you need to be able to deliver it. I also see that this might potentially, that the COVID funding might actually become tight. The funding to hygiene might actually become tighter in the coming years, particularly if there's any recession coming out of COVID-19. And one of the biggest concerns, I think, from our side is, will all of this spending on hygiene and hand and surface hygiene actually lead to structural changes, or will we see in 3 or 4 years' time that there's been a lot of money invested in more short-term unsustainable projects? But overall, I would say that there are a lot of opportunities out there. Just be careful about how you approach them. Jimena, can we go to the Menti questions, please, just to get an idea of how everyone is positioned at the moment?
Yeah, so there's a bit of debate in the chat box. Do you want to, it's related to the methodology question from Somaya. Do you want to
no, let's do that at the
look
Q&A
at it now,
again.
or let's do that? Okay, so we'll go back to it on the Q&A, and now I'm going to then Menti. So
okay, this is interesting. Okay, that's okay. So we've got some smaller targets in there. I think that can actually be just as big a challenge as well, sometimes even bigger a challenge than raising the large amounts of funding. Jimena, can we go to the next question? For Patrick Mwanza, the Menti login details are at the top, 720795. So KPIs also means key performance indicators. So do you have targets? Do you know how much you need to raise? I'm waiting for people to say maybe. Actually, I'm really impressed that so many people are saying yes. That's great. Because how do you know what to go after or what to raise if you don't know what your target is? Okay, and then the last question for this. Do you have a web page with a clear ask? So do people know that you need money? Oh, so there's a maybe and a no in there. A few no's. So how do people know that you need money? Wow, quite a few no's. Okay, that's really interesting. Okay, thank you very much. That's really interesting. That's definitely something that I'd like to come back to those people, particularly that have said no about KPIs and no's, and see if we can no's on the donate button and see if we can perhaps help with that. Okay, I'm going to share the presentation again, and I'm going to hand over to Esther once I get this back open. Oh, I don't know why that's 2 seconds, sorry. I'm now sharing it back to you all. Sorry, technology sometimes gets the better of me. Okay, hopefully you can all see this now.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks,
Great.
Bryony. All right, thank you. As Bryony already mentioned at the start of the presentation, the section that I'm going to present is about how to find funding opportunities. There are a couple of things that I will cover in this section. So first of all, how to even start looking for opportunities. Then I'll look into how to scan for opportunities, networking, and finally, how to develop a pitch. Next slide. All right, how to start. So first of all, what we'll do for this, at least in this context, is divide fundraising into two. So we'll look at reactive fundraising and proactive fundraising. So under reactive fundraising, we're talking about responding to opportunities or requests or direct requests from donors or clients. And in this presentation, we'll look at how and where to scan for these opportunities and what kind of networks there are that might be able to share certain opportunities with you. So letting your networks know that you're looking for opportunities and money. And then the next bit of this section will look at proactive fundraising. So that's actually actively seeking out opportunities from potential donors and clients. And under this bit, we'll look at the networking, and we'll look at creating and developing a pitch. So next slide. All right, so this is also a Menti exercise. If you click again, you'll see it. So this is, if Jimena wouldn't mind sharing the Menti question. So basically, there are a lot of terminologies out there for different opportunities. So the question then for you is, how have you seen funding opportunities referred to? Oh, that's a lot. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, lots of acronyms. That's also something we see quite a lot, which also makes people very nervous when they're looking at an opportunity. They're not so sure what exactly is being asked. Great. Thanks. Nice. All right. I guess we can go back to the presentation.
You should be able to see the presentation again now.
Yeah, that's there again. Next slide. Yeah, great. So there were a lot of terms mentioned, and there are a lot of acronyms mentioned, and it shows that a lot of you have had a lot of experience with looking for opportunities and have come across quite a few of the definitions already. So I've just put a few of them up here in a list. There are way more, as you've already shown in the Menti exercise. But let's say starting with grants and tenders. So this is how often opportunities are referred to. And if you look up different definitions, what you'll see often is that grants are usually opportunities that are not for profit, and tenders are opportunities that allow applicants to make a profit from them through a contract. And when an opportunity is published, often what they'll start with before even publishing opportunity is they'll publish a forecast. This is often what funders will do is sort of give a preview of something that's in the mix or in the works, and this is a great opportunity for applicants to already have an idea of what what is coming, what will be coming out in the coming months, and already have an opportunity to sort of prepare themselves for the opportunity once it's published. Then there's requests for information and letters of intent, and this also happens just before an opportunity is published. And often when they're already working on an opportunity, funders will often publish a request for information in the hopes to receive additional technical information from potential applicants. And this can already influence the call that will be published. So it's always a great opportunity for an applicant to, and it's highly encouraged to respond to requests for information, especially if you want to have a little bit of influence on the outcome of the final call document. Then there's the request for proposals or request for applications. This is the actual funding opportunity announcement. These will come, I've just picked two here, so RFPs, RFAs, but there are so many different ways of naming a call, an opportunity announcement. But basically this is the application that you will respond to, and this is where all the information about the call will be found. It's often in a document that is then published on the website of the donor. Next slide. All right, so scanning for opportunities. We're just gonna, there are thousands of different websites you can go to look for opportunities, but we're just gonna highlight a few here. And feel free to scan the little QR codes. That'll take you directly to the websites that are mentioned here, but we'll also have a look at them. So we have 4 websites that we'll just have a quick look at. So there's DevEx, the development of funds for NGOs, but we'll start with DevEx. So DevEx is a website that, like Funds for NGOs and Development Aid, it's a site that is a great place if you want to see several different kinds of opportunities all in one place. I do have to mention that several of these websites are not free, and it is very limited. If you want the free version, you have very limited access. What you have is on the left side, you can see the different opportunities. On the top side, you see where it says find funding. You can put in keywords. You can alter the search parameters, and then you will. This will affect the kind of results you get. What is nice about DevEx as well is that they have additional resources here. So, for example, news items, jobs that are being advertised. So that's also very useful in terms of knowing what the funding landscape looks like. We can have a look at the other links. So, for example, development aid. So it looks slightly different, but same idea. You can search. You can search using keywords. Here as well, they have great. For instance, you can search for advocacy. And here as well, this is a website that. If you're a paid user, you'll have a lot more access to the opportunities and to knowing what exactly the call is requesting. But one really good tip then, if you do not want to have a paid account, what you can do always is to just Google. Highlight the title of the opportunity and look it up. Often you'll be brought straight to the actual website where this opportunity is from. And often the call document itself is available there. We can have a look at Funds for NGOs. So Funds for NGOs is another great website. This website has all types of opportunities, starting from really tiny opportunities to really large opportunities. If you want to search, you can search for opportunities according to the different categories that they have. Oh, we have a paid version. But if you want, you can have a look at the different opportunities according to the different categories that they have presented. So there, what Brian is showing. There is a water and sanitation category, but there are lots of other ones. One disadvantage of Funds for NGOs is they don't have a very great search function. So you literally have the entire list of all the whatever sector you looked at. You'll have the entire list of all the opportunities that have been posted from that sector. but still a great website. Okay, if we go back to the, so then there's Europe Aid. This one, at least, it's free for all. If you can view all the opportunities for free, but this is then EU tender, so it is a little bit more specific. It's not all the different development agencies, but at least you can view all the tenders for free. And there are different search parameters that you can use. The search function is very good as well. And then going back, then there are definitely lots of other resources you can look at. There's the government websites that Brian already mentioned, so USAID, DFID, then there's the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, that's the Belgian government. There are many, and there are even others, like, of course, the African Development Bank, the Asia Development Bank. These are also great resources to have a look at. I see that Jimena's hand is raised.
Just there was a question, but in the chat box, but Brian answered it, and
okay.
Also these services, when that are paid, they have different prices, so it's also good to like explore what suits more your organization. They can really change the range between them. So yeah.
Great. Okay, so the next slide. So we want to share a few tips. When you're scanning for opportunities, it's not just click on the website, type in some key terms, and then that's it. There's some more things we'd like to just share, like little tips we've come across and might help you. So the first one is subscribe. Subscribe to the newsletters, subscribe to the alerts. Even though DevX is not free, you can subscribe to alerts and you can subscribe to some of the articles. And that means that you will get notified if new opportunities are posted. This is really useful if you, for instance, don't have the time to check on very regularly for opportunities on their website and all the other websites that you might be interested in. So do that for sure. The next one is the search parameters. We already had a look, but here on the right, you can see an example of the DevX search function. Make sure to narrow down your search parameters. It's always helpful because otherwise you get very overwhelmed with all the different opportunities on the website. So for instance, include definitely use keywords. Make sure you know what type of funding you're looking, what type of tender you're looking for, what type of program. Maybe you're just interested to know what is out there, what's in the forecast. Maybe you just only want to look at a certain geographical area. So make sure to include those things just to make it a bit easier for yourself to navigate through all the different tenders and opportunities that are out there. And then also search outside of WASH or search outside of advocacy. Search in other sectors, for example, gender and women or environment. There might be water and sanitation and hygiene opportunities within the other sectors. So definitely search a little bit outside of the WASH scope. Then also have a look at what your competitors are, who their donors and funders are. Many of them have websites where they just display all their donors and their partners. And this could be a great source of inspiration for yourself in case you're stumped and not sure who is out there, who's giving funding. So here we have an example of SNV. It's free information, use it. All right. And lastly, we've already said it before, let people know that you're looking. Are you like, for instance, join networks, make sure that people know that you're out there, make sure that people know that you're looking for funding so that they think of you when an opportunity comes in. Even ourselves within our strategic partnerships department, we can't do it alone. We're very dependent on our colleagues. They bring in, many of them have great networks. They bring in the opportunities, they identify opportunities as well. So make sure that people know that you're looking, and make sure they know who to send these opportunities to if something comes up. So definitely do that. All right, next slide. All right, so networking. So before you even start networking, what's really important is to have cases for support. And basically, a case for support is a short, straightforward document that tells prospective donors what your organization hopes to accomplish with their funds. You can do an entire webinar on this, so I'm just going to try to squeeze it all into one slide, but there's so much more to do this, but we just want to highlight how important it is to have a case for support. If you're working on a case for support, if you don't have one already for your organization, you really should have one or several of these cases for support. But what's important is that they should be short and detailed. They should be factual, so make sure to put in numbers, for instance, the cost of things, the number of people you're targeting, that kind of information. Just be very factual. Don't be vague. Don't go off on tangent stuff. Just be factual. And very important is you need to be compelling. Make sure you appeal to the reader's emotion. Make sure that when they read it, they feel something. So basically, in a nutshell, present your problem, propose an action plan. Don't forget to include costs and how much it's going to cost, what will $1 achieve, that kind of information. And make sure they know that this is urgent. Make sure they know why it has to happen now. A case for support is really important, not only for your donors or prospective donors, but it's also important for yourself, for your organization, because it guides you as well. Next slide. All right. And now networking. So many of you may have heard this expression before, the 6 degrees of separation. And that's the idea that all people are 6 or fewer social connections away from each other. So that means you and me, we are only 6 or less connections away from any donor that we might be interested in, even Bill Gates. But how do we get to them? So that would be through networks, of course. And you have access to many more networks than you may realize. You have, of course, your own networks, all the people around you. You have your colleagues, the people you work with, your partners. You work with so many different partners, and they too have networks that you can easily tap into. And of course, your own friends, your own personal network. And it's very important to continually be building on these networks. So it's very important. In order to build these networks, you need to make sure that you realize that these are people. So you need to get to know these people, know what they're interested in, who they are. And this is what we would call the difference between making cold calls or warm calls. So cold calls would be if you try to approach a connection and using cold call, that's without doing any research, without actually knowing who this person is, what their interests are, what makes them tick. Whereas if you go in with a warm call, that would be more having done research, knowing what their interest is, knowing how to approach them, knowing what kind of person they are, and if possible, already getting in touch with them through a referral. And this can be through a personal referral, like through social media, even LinkedIn. But that's a warm call, and it's much better and much more effective to approach potential connections through warm calls. And it's very important to note, and people get nervous when you say networking, but networking can happen anywhere, at any moment. It can be at a conference, it can be at a meeting, even a birthday party. And in any situation is a networking opportunity situation. So even in an elevator. So next slide. That brings us to the elevator pitch. It's often called an elevator pitch, but as you know, this can be done anywhere, as we just said. And this is basically 60 seconds to impress. It can be more than 60 seconds, depending on the situation. But it's basically your opportunity to impress a potential donor investor. And this could happen at any moment, so you need to have a strong pitch ready. And while that can seem very scary, we have what we call the 5 W's: the who, what, where, why, and when. So in your pitch, make sure you tell the person who you are, what problem you solve, where your target market is, so where you work, why they should pick you and your solution, and when you can already start working for them. And when you're doing this, avoid jargon and buzzwords. It's not cool and sexy. It can be off-putting. don't use language that they might not understand. Try to be simple. Try to come. Don't be too technical. And if you have a much longer conversation, it's very important to listen. Don't just tell them everything. Also make sure that you get feedback back and listen carefully to that feedback. Make sure it's a two-way conversation. I don't know how many of you have already had experiences with pitches, but we would like to open up and see if anybody would like to share an elevator pitch that they may have.
You can put your hand up and in the web, and then we'll pick on one or two people, and we will time you. Or I will pick on someone to do it. Okay, I'm gonna ask Ingeborg then, because she's the picture that I can see in front of me. Ingeborg, can you give me an elevator pitch for IRC, please?
Okay, well, I'm really the person who can do this, but not really. Okay, so my name is Ingeborg Crooked from IRC. IRC is trying to expand our great work in the countries we do in more countries. For example, in Bangladesh, we have great connections in Bangladesh. We want to work on waste. Lots of places in Bangladesh are really littered with waste, not only solid waste, also fecal waste from toilets getting full and not emptied. And we have a great solution with a Dutch company to solve that problem, to solve the waste, get rid of the waste, and even transform it into electricity you can use for other purposes. So we have all the things there. The thing is tested. It's just the money we would need, and as a pilot or as a thing to scale, we would need 1 million, and we can, we could start next month.
Great. Oh, I've got 1 million sitting in my back pocket. Thank you.
Sorry, this is really very difficult.
I'm sorry. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Ingeborg. But that is sort of the point we're making. It's quite difficult, but that's why it's important to have this ready beforehand. Like we think it's a very important step to take. But you did great, Ingeborg.
Yeah, well, you can see I can very much improve on this. So, but thanks.
Esther, there was also a suggestion. Well, I suggested that Katerina, but I see that Evita is also nominating Martin in the chat box. But I don't know if anyone maybe feels a bit braver now and wants to put their hand up.
Oh, Katerina.
Go on, Katerina. Give us your pitch.
Well, I'm going to give you, actually, I have one always on the back of my mind. It's because we got trained in IRC, and it's really about the water sector. So when people ask, you are in a plane or something, and then you have someone next to you, or you meet in a conference, but outside of the water sector, which for me was always the most difficult one to do. And people ask, so what you work on? And I always ask with a question that grabs their attention, which is, so do you know what's the main cause of death of children under 4 in the world? And that really whoa. And then people mention a lot of things, but not immediately. They mention hygiene at a certain point. And then I said, well, I work with governments and with civil society organizations to make sure that there's less kids dying of waterborne diseases. So that's the general one, and it's pretty. I started to. I like it because I know how people react on their faces. The one on civil society. So if I'm in a water conference, and usually I'm talking, or I take time to talk with funders or donors or develop relationships with private net worth individuals. So they asked, so what's the most interesting thing you're working on? And I said, well, what do you know about the water sector? And then we started talking a little bit about the problems, and everything is so slow, and it's governance, and it takes so much time. And then I say, yeah, but you know how we got progress in a lot of our countries with not only water services, but also other, women's rights, education. So we got a lot of progress because there were the civic movements, and people had spaces to complain, and created those spaces to complain, and then things went much faster. And that's what I'm working on with many other partners in other countries. It's really to try to create that space so citizens from those countries can much faster have improvement in services. So that's the watershed related one.
Nice, thank you, Katrina.
Okay, I think Esther, I think it's now over to Jimena.
Yeah, so as we introduced in the agenda, I will focus more on the how, or on those practical considerations that we need into account before launching or taking the dive to do reactive and proactive fundraising. And one of the key things that we always look at when thinking of fundraising, and the first things that we ask is, do you have a strategy, a resource mobilization plan, even a marketing strategy? What is your strategy? And this is important to consider and to have clear where you're going, because fundraising represents an investment of your own organization's resources. So often in donors' funding do not cover fundraising activities if, for example, they're funding you project-based, and if you're an organization that has mostly project or program-based funding, which is allocated for specific activities, there is very limited space or resources that you would have to make the necessary time investment and resource investment that you require to, for example, access to those paid services, allocate time to respond for a proposal, or go to conferences and engage in networking and keep up those relationships. So it is very important to consider before starting to mobilize resources or starting to work on it, is to breathe and think of your strategy or your plan. And for your plan, you need to be aware of how much does your organization needs to fundraise every year, and also considering the long-term landscape. So if you fundraise this year, probably you will receive the funds next year, and how many long-term funds will you receive for how many years? Do you want to grow or continue the same size? What is the aims of your organization? Do you have key approaches or a key program that you want to scale? So are you focusing on scaling up already proven approaches that your organization has worked on? Some organizations really focus on certain key pilots and selling those to scale up. Other organizations work more on the development of new ideas, and this is important to know, so you know what you're aiming to do or to fundraise for. And also it is interesting and very important to be aware of where does your funding comes from. How dependent are you in one donor or a few donors? If you're too dependent on one donor, and if that donor strategy changes, or that donor doesn't have any more resources, then the sustainability of your organization might put at risk. So these are like key things that you should consider when looking at your strategy or your plan to start fundraising. The next slide, please. So once you have that strategy or you know what you're fundraising for, it is interesting to see the fundraising funnel, or this is actually a sales funnel, but for fundraising. And in red, you see normally a very big landscape, and that's the funder landscape that Bryony and Esther presented to us, where you have opportunities to map donors, meet donors, get intel, so networking, conferences. You have several donors as opportunities. But from all of those donors that are out there, not all of them represent potential leads for you that you might want to continue exploring and investing in, either submitting a proposal or either building a relationship. And this is important to keep in mind because, as I said, fundraising is an investment for your organization. Then you have, from all of those leads that you identify, you are invited to submit a proposal or a project idea, or you can respond to a call for proposals for a limited, again, number of those potential leads. So the funnel keeps stretching. Then from those invitations, only a few you get to develop programs. And only a few you get to develop probably a full proposal that then is submitted and implemented. So what this shows us is that we start probably with 100 donors as mapped or ideas, and you might end up with only 5 programs funded. So it is important to consider this. And also I want to do then a Menti exercise to check with you and self-reflect on, next slide, please. So self-reflect on your organization's efforts and skills. Where do you see greater difficulty? Do you have difficulty in the upper level, so identifying those opportunities or those leads? Or do you have difficulty in making those leads actual invitations for proposals and actual submissions? For example, to give an example of CIMAVI, we are aware that our biggest challenge is to make the jump between the leads and ideas that we have to concrete invitations for proposals. And that gives us an idea of where do we need to focus and build our strength. So it is important to consider where you are. So I want to do a Menti exercise. I will share my Menti. And I want you to think of those different steps in the funnel and say, and put it for you that is very difficult or very easy. And then we can check where we are all in a scale. So I'm going to share the Menti.
Just to be aware that the code at the top of this isn't correct. The code is 720795.
Yes, so the code is the one that is going to be, oh, sorry, this is not right here. So here it is, and the code is 720795. So I think, well, yeah, 2 people have voted, and it seems most of the things are easy. That's good. But definitely most difficulty is in identifying the concrete leads and making that become a real invitation for program development or for a proposal. Okay, so I see it moving. Yeah, so I see most of the people have contributed. Does anyone want to explain how you voted and what, yeah, how do you explain where you are as an organization, and maybe, yeah, someone outside of the Netherlands wants to share with us their experience on where they see themselves in the fundraising funnel? Raise your hand and we will
I saw Digby Joy put his hand up and then took it down again quite quickly. Too late.
Too late, we saw it. Is the person that raised his hand going to talk?
Yeah.
Riley?
I don't know. Go ahead, Digby. I think you need to take yourself off mute.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
All right. Yeah. First of all, I think I have double clicked on the hand icon, so it immediately goes on, then off. Apology for that. Anyway, so what I would like to say is that, I mean, I have actually answered that question from my previous experience. I mean, when I used to work for BRAC. So at that time, I had the experiences of going through the fundraising process for a couple of times. So from that experiences, I can tell you, I mean, what I have experienced is that this networking things and mapping donors is somewhat seems difficult to me. Some of the processes are relatively easy, like keeping track of them or submitting the process. But mapping donors and designing the program, or I would say program development, these are the two things often seemed difficult to me due to two reasons. This is actually because of a combination between how the donor or the how the donor is thinking and how I can express my need to design the program. So there is a very simple trade-off between these two things. I can see. I mean, a few minutes ago, I saw one comment made by Katerina that these donors are not system nerds. So I mean, we sometimes we have to realize something in the field, then we have to interpret that language in a different way to write the proposal so that the donor can understand that. So I would say this is what something always seemed very difficult to me. So this is what I can share. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think that is actually a very good point. And that is one of the biggest difficulties, is from jumping from that mapping or the general identification of donors to really identify those key ones, and then be able to build that relation and to talk to that donor in a way that is interested and shares your interest, and that is triggered by you and by your work. It's also important to consider, like, there's a lot of also personal relationship building and a lot of investment to happen, and that is part of the difficulty as well. But thank you very much for sharing. So I'm going to move on to continue with the presentation. But I invite you to look at this in your organizations, then also more in detail, also with your fundraisers colleagues. So next slide, Bryony. So once you have that donor mapping, or you have that idea of all of those donors that you might be interested in. One of the key things to be able to focus your efforts on those donors that are really that really have potential to support your organization and that you have potential to be successful. It's important to set those priorities, and this is a Venn diagram that is really easy to use, and what I like it is that it makes it visual as well. So you can do this exercise back in your own organizations, and it's really look at who are the donors that have resources. Do they have resources? Do they have money available? So do they have a funding round open, or do we know that they have funding? The second thing is, do those donors share the same interests with me? So they have money and interest with me, or share and the same interest that I do. And the third thing to consider is, do I have a relation with that donor? Does that donor already knows me? Do I have an entry point? And next, so, and when those three conditions comply, then those are your key priorities. Sorry, back. So those donors where you have resources, a relation, and a shared interest, those are your key priorities, and those are the donors that you want to focus on, building further relation, strengthening it, and potentially then building a partnership for funding with them. The next thing that it's important to do, and that's our next slide, please, Bryony, is to know and understand your potential donors. So the previous Venn diagram gives you a very overall picture, or an easy way to make prioritization. But as I said, because fundraising is an investment, you need to be sure of who are your donors and what does it entail to go for an opportunity with that donor. So what type of donor is it? What is the funding range? How much does that donor normally give? Does it give only 20K, 5K, or 100K? So how much? What is the time frame of that funding? Are we talking of a donor that will give a 1-year support, or that usually commits to more years? How to access it? So is it a donor that do I need to apply via call for proposals, like, for example, European Union, or most of institutional donors? Or is it a donor that I need to build a relationship with to be invited to submit an application or a project idea? What is the effort to access or to win this donor? So this relates to what Bryony was presenting in the beginning. So really, how much effort, time, and resources do I need to commit to win that opportunity? And what is the effort to manage? So is it a donor that has very administrative burden, or that is very strict on some administration and management, or is it an easy donor? And this is important to consider as well. And finally, risks. Also, what are those risks that entails for me to go with this donor? If it is a corporate, are there any reputational risks with working from this donor? So for example, many of organizations don't work with tobacco, with oil producers, mining, arm dealer, arm companies, etc. So considering also from an ethical perspective, what risks are they? And what risks are they if also if I go for this donor, if I submit an application and it's not good enough, like what happens? So what are the risks for my organization, or what are the risks if I fail to comply with the donor because I cannot manage the grant or the resources? Then it's important to check the interest. So again, are the interests aligned between what this donor wants and with what I propose as an organization, and the geographic scope. And with this, after doing this exercise, it gives you a better idea of whether that donor those donors that we have mapped or that we have in our ideas, if we should really commit or invest to make them concrete leads and to submit applications or to engage for partnerships. Next slide. Then once we have an opportunity, and most of those donors, they work via tenders or opportunities. Also, a key skill to consider is how to read that opportunity. So I want to just do a Menti exercise to check of when you're looking for, when you're reading a request for proposal or an opportunity, what are the things that you look for? What are the main things that you consider to see if this is an opportunity for your organization or not? So you can go to Menti. The code is on the top of the screen, and you can start putting in your input. Okay, ethics, the available funding, the strategic fit, indeed. The match with the organization outcomes, that definitely is important. Eligibility, that is one of the first things to check. Is your organization eligible? Money, past funding, that is a good one. Timeline, reputation, aligned with vision, flexibility, resources, overhead. That is a very good one, is how much of overhead do they allow or do they cover? We often miss that, and that is normally hidden in the budget indications. So it's important to look at it. Ease of process, location, unrestricted, be polite, funding range, resources. Okay, I see some weird ones, but okay, let's go back to the presentation. So next one, please. So here's a table of what are like those normal key questions that we should ask ourselves. And we will be sharing this with the handout after the webinar. And one of the first things that we sometimes miss is eligibility. So is my organization eligible? I know it sounds very basic, and you probably all must say, well, duh, yeah. But it's often not the case for everyone. And sometimes we forget to check this because we get too excited about the amount of funding, the priorities, and the matches with our outcomes, and we forget to check this. Also, something very important is the time frame of the opportunity and of the funding. It's very important to check the deadline, how on top of it you are on the deadline. And there are other things also to consider that were not mentioned, but that are very important. And it is how much time and staff do I require to apply for this or to go for this opportunity? So it's important to consider the process. Okay, so it's a difficult process. I need a lot of time and staff. Do I have that? And also to consider your opportunities of your percentage of winning or your possibilities of winning. So matching the effort and your possibilities to win. Also important to consider, do you need external resources? Is it such a difficult donor that you need to hire a reviewer? Or, for example, it's more a foundation or an individual that you need, for example, to propose a very nice proposal that has a beautiful layout, and therefore you need a designer. So those kind of things you need to consider, like how much of it do I need?
Jimena, I'm just letting
yes.
you know we've only got 10 minutes left.
Yeah, so these are the questions, and I'm almost finished. So please go to the next slide. And then to finally, to conclude, I want to, sometimes we're really afraid of fundraising, and especially if you come from programs and you're more used to work with implementing the programs. And it's nice to consider fundraising as similar to the project development cycle. So you start out with an idea, you develop, you design it, you plan it and then implement it, you monitor, evaluate it, then you have some learning, and based on that learning, you develop a new idea. So we are always into this continuous learning process. Next slide. And the final thing, and maybe you're wondering, well, this is fundraising and we haven't touched upon proposal writing. And that is because proposal writing is really just the tip of the iceberg. So often I see with organizations that their main focus is like once they receive an opportunity, they start writing in immediately, and they get worried about filling in the format or answering the questions. And that is really the final step that you take. You first really need to, and even here in this image, we don't have it, but you need to identify the opportunity or build the relationship. And once you have that, you can design the project, and based on that, you develop your results. And as a final step, you write your opportunity. So that's why we haven't focused too much into the writing per se of a proposal. And next one. And that's it. So we want to know if there are any like burning questions that remain from you from throughout the webinar. So not just on what I just presented to you.
And we do have one final Menti question as well, I think, before everyone goes, which is a follow-up piece.
Yeah.
So please put your hand up if you want to ask a question. We probably have about 5 minutes. And then we'll just go to the last Menti question before finishing on time. Go ahead, Katarina, you were first.
Thank you. Thank you for such an amazing amount of information. I have a question on KPIs and thresholds. Do you have more or less, finger in the air, for an organization to raise 1 million, 2 million, you need like a full-time equivalent or two-time equivalent? Do you have any threshold or on this compare, especially with the water sector, do you have any benchmark?
It depends. It depends on where you're raising your funds from. So if you look at your overall revenue, there are benchmarks in terms of how much organizations tend to invest in their fundraising team, and their fundraising team can be made up of both just fundraisers and also communication staff, depending on where you raise your money from. So in terms of benchmark, Simavi tends to spend about 8 or 9% of its revenue on fundraising. IRC spends significantly less. around about 2 or 3%. If you look at an organization like Watershed, they spend 25% because that's the maximum you're allowed to spend in the UK on fundraising. If you look at Water for People, they spend 8 or 9% of their total revenue in investing in fundraising. So if you then sort of break it down into how many members of staff that is, depending on where you're raising funds from. If you're raising money from institutional donors, you're normally looking at a KPI of anywhere to 1 to 5 million euros per person on how much they need to raise from institutional donors on any given year. If you're looking at raising funds from other types of funding, like high net worth individuals, your targets will possibly be slightly less, unless it's ultra high net worth individuals. If you're raising money from the public, again, you will have a lot more people engaged in trying to undertake that type of funding for lower returns in terms of percentage against what you're investing. I mean, it's a how long is a piece of string kind of a question.
So thanks, and Bryony, there's another question from Somaya. She's asking, how did you apply this process that we described to Watershed? So I guess the design to the submission, and what was the result and impact? Can you explain maybe, Somaya, your question? Somaya?
Yes, sure. Thanks, Jimena, for the opportunity. Well, you walked us through this whole process of how to raise funds, basically. And I'm wondering, because this is from the fundraising work package, so I'm curious to hear what was the process as a work package you went through to pass this knowledge to the other work packages, to the local partners that you work with. And we know that for Watershed 2, we didn't get the big funding, but are the local partners capable of fundraising for the projects that we started with them through Watershed 1? And can they sustain themselves afterwards by these knowledge that you all have and now are sharing it with us at the end of the Watershed?
So in this work package, we have had a slow start, but we are focusing right now, and that's why we're doing this series of webinars, and we have a series of activities to support the partners in further fundraising. But this is something that we have always seen as based on demand. Because we are not to impose to partners and organizations to fundraise for Watershed. So we share opportunities with them. We have mentioned that we provide support, and we are doing now these webinars to share tools and some skills with them. But we are not to it's also there. All Watershed partners and members, we are all independent organizations, and it's up to us as well to see how we bring the continuation. But we are trying to make sure that we can bring the necessary support as Watershed finishes. There are some other questions about crowdfunding. Ranjan, I think that's a good question, and it's not on my expertise, but that may be something we can link up to include in our next webinar. We do have experts at CIMAVI on crowdfunding, but
I think Zabaya has a question. I think that has to be the last question, and then if you bring up the Menti question for after that. So Zabaya, do you want to go ahead with your question?
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a good evening from here to all. I think this is really a very good summary of all of our works, what we have done in different way. But main curiosity of mine, that's that in this present situation or any kind of context, how do we know that which donors are relevant to our interests? Yeah, there is. You have mentioned already. Mapping is important, networking, etc. But at the same time, all these are exhausted, or no? There is also some kind of out of box realities there. Thank you very much.
So I'll answer briefly. I think unfortunately there's no short way of doing this. You do have to do the mapping. I think the shortest way of finding out what funding is available for the type of organization that you work for is looking at your direct competitors. That's probably the quickest way of seeing who else might be in the market and be prepared to fund you. But other than that, it is sort of doing some of the legwork in terms of networking and looking at some of the websites and so on that Esther showed earlier. I know that we're meant to finish. I'd really like if just everyone could just stay on for one more minute. And Jimena, if you could share the final Menti question. Yeah. We'd really like to design a follow-up webinar in September, which will be sort of a build on this. So maybe to do a deeper dive for an hour and a half, 2 hours into something else. And we'd really like to know what would be most useful for you. Because this was kind of an overview of everything. And yeah, there's more detail out there, lots.
So in this option, you don't have word limits, so you can add what was interesting for you to learn, so as a key lesson, and then you can also ask what you want us to further develop. So like that, we know. Okay, so I see pitch and proposal writing. We can workshop to write cases for support, format a proposal, how to make sure I answer questions, really exploring use of letters of intent. How to find people to network. Okay, those are donor mapping, right shop, case for support.
Yeah, there's 3 on cases for support there, which isn't really a surprise. I did think that would come up. I think I'd like one of those too. I'm kidding. I'm quite happy to do that. Okay, and donor mapping again. Okay, so interesting.
And funding funnels, what's inside it.
Okay, we've got about 4 weeks worth of content there.
Yes. So maybe, Bryony, you can go back to the presentation just for the next steps.
Sure.
To share with everyone, and then we give it a wrap.
Yeah, and I'm sorry for overrunning slightly, everybody.
Yes.
We did try our best.
So for the next steps, you will receive this presentation and some handout materials for practical use. We will send an evaluation to share your thoughts about this webinar and what we can do to improve, and also to further explore that deep dive for the second webinar. I want to stress that Work Package 10 continues to support the Watershed partners in fundraising. So if you have support needed, you just can contact us, Bryony, myself, or Esther. We will set up, so as I said, we will set up a second webinar, and we're also working on the legacy campaign, which probably will give all of us quite interesting communications materials to finish Watershed with a big bang, and also to mobilize interest in advocacy on the water sector. So this is all. Thank you very much for joining.
Yeah, thank you very much for joining. I know it was late for some of you, so thank you.
Bastante.
Great, thank you very much, everybody.